Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, talking to you on a day where it seems like we might finally have some good news when it comes to Gaza. Everyone is reporting now that a ceasefire deal has been agreed, and we will be discussing what seems to be in it. It hasn't been published yet, but this could be a pretty momentous occasion. Tonight's show, I'll be joined throughout by Helena, NoJustice, MTG. Helena, great to have you on the show.
Pretty momentous day for us to be covering this evening, and it's a pleasure to be covering it with Novara Media today.
And hopefully later as well, I'll be joined by Daniel Levy, former Israeli negotiator, now a Middle East analyst, and always speaks very powerfully on this topic. After 15 months of brutal assaults on Gaza, Israel and Hamas appear to have agreed a historic ceasefire deal. If it holds, it will bring to an end over a year of carnage, in which at least 47,000 Palestinians have been killed and tens of thousands more injured. Now, I say if it holds because we've been here many times before, with one ceasefire after another being touted as complete, only for Israel to change the terms at the last minute. But the signs this time are promising. Incoming US President Donald Trump posted this on Truth Social. So he says, "We have a deal for the hostages in the Middle East. They will be released shortly. Thank you." The deal has also been confirmed by the Biden administration, and in Gaza, there were scenes of jubilation. Where progress has been made, it may be because of one significant change in the players involved. The Biden administration is on its way out with just a few days left in office, and they're desperate to seal peace in Gaza as part of Biden's legacy. Whether it will cancel out his reputation as a genocide enabler is a different question. Meanwhile, Trump is about to enter the White House as US president, and reports are emerging that his Middle East envoy, real estate developer Stephen Witkoff, who's Jewish, has taken a more aggressive approach to Israel's leaders. This is from Haaretz. Last Friday evening, Stephen Witkoff, US President-elect Donald Trump's Middle East envoy, called from Qatar to tell Prime Minister Netanyahu's aides that he would be coming to Israel the following afternoon. The aides politely explained that that was in the middle of the Sabbath, but that the Prime Minister would gladly meet him Saturday night. Witkoff's blunt reaction took them by surprise. He explained to them in salty English that Shabbat was of no interest to him. His message was loud and clear. Thus, in an unusual departure from official practice, the Prime Minister showed up at his office for an official meeting with Witkoff, who then returned to Qatar to seal the deal. So a very different approach to the Biden administration, and Witkoff also appears to have obtained concessions from Netanyahu that had appeared unimaginable just months ago. So this is from Haaretz as well. Witkoff has forced Israel to accept a plan that Netanyahu had repeatedly rejected over the past half year. Hamas has not budged from its position that the hostages' freedom must be conditioned on the release of Palestinian prisoners, the easy part, and a complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, the hard one. Netanyahu rejected this condition, and thus was born the partial deal proposed by Egypt. Initially, the talk was of a limited humanitarian deal. More and more conditions were slowly appended until it grew into a much bigger proposal with clear outlines, a hostage release, new regional arrangements, and a full withdrawal. The Philadelphia corridor, which Netanyahu last summer termed the bedrock of Israel's existence, is part of the deal. At Egypt's request, Israel will fully withdraw from it in the first phase. The deal hasn't yet been made public, but some details have emerged. It pretty much seems to follow the three-phase structure of the so-called Biden deal announced last May, although never signed on to by the Israelis. The Associated Press report having seen a draft document and say this about phase one. So this will involve Hamas releasing 33 hostages, including female civilians and soldiers, and children and civilians over 50. Israel will release 30 Palestinian prisoners for each civilian hostage and 50 for each female soldier. There'll be a halt to fighting. Israeli forces will move out of populated areas to the edges of the Gaza Strip, and displaced Palestinians can begin returning home, with more aid entering the Strip. Once the ceasefire comes into effect, the order seems to be that Hamas will release living hostages first. If there aren't 33 hostages still alive, bodies will be handed over. One added complication is that not all hostages are held by Hamas, which means also getting other resistance groups to agree to the terms of this phase of the deal. It's also been reported that displaced Palestinians will be able to return to the north of Gaza on foot only. The Israelis presumably saying this is so weapons can't be transported to the north, but it's going to lead to a very inhuman situation, such as we've been used to seeing over the past 15 months. In terms of Palestinian prisoners to be released, 30 of them are expected to be Palestinians serving life sentences. In the 42 days of the first phase, this is significant, Hamas and Israel must also agree the details of the second phase. And that's going to be very complicated, to say the least. So Associated Press say this about phase 2 of the ceasefire agreement. All remaining hostages are to be released in return for a complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and a sustainable calm, which to me seems like that's going to be a difficult word to define. Associated Press say that seemingly basic exchange opens up much bigger issues. Israel has said it will not agree to a complete withdrawal until Hamas's military and political capabilities are eliminated and it cannot rearm, ensuring Hamas no longer runs Gaza. Hamas says it will not hand over the last hostages until Israel removes all troops from everywhere in Gaza. Of course, Israel is not going to be able to achieve its stated aim of eliminating Hamas, and that's something that US Secretary of State Antony Blinken seemed to confirm in a speech last night.
We've long made the point to the Israeli government that Hamas cannot be defeated by a military campaign alone, that without a clear alternative, a post-conflict plan, and a credible political horizon for the Palestinians, Hamas, or something just as abhorrent and dangerous, will grow back. That's exactly what's happened in northern Gaza since October 7th. Each time Israel completes its military operations and pulls back, Hamas militants regroup and reemerge because there's nothing else to fill the void. Indeed, we assess that Hamas has recruited almost as many new militants as it has lost. That is a recipe for an enduring insurgency and perpetual war.
Now, that's a pretty new line from the Biden administration, who've previously held the position that peace in Gaza requires the elimination of Hamas. It seems they've finally woken up to the idea that you can't bomb an idea out of existence. Also in that speech, Blinken gave this description of what a post-war Gazan government would look like.
We believe that the Palestinian Authority should invite international partners to help establish and run an interim administration with responsibility for key civil sectors in Gaza, like banking, water, energy, health, civil coordination with Israel. The international community would provide funding, technical support, and oversight. The interim administration would include Palestinians from Gaza and representatives from the PA, selected following meaningful consultation with communities in Gaza, and would hand over complete responsibility to a fully reformed PA administration as soon as it's feasible. The PA will need to carry out swift, far-reaching reform to build more transparent, accountable governance, continuing a process that it began last year. Israel will have to accept reuniting Gaza and the West Bank under the leadership of a reformed PA.
Given the need for the parties to at least agree the terms of a new governance model in Gaza, one that may involve steps towards a united Palestine, phase 3 of the deal is probably quite a long way off. Associated Press has these vague details, so it will involve bodies of deceased Israeli hostages exchanged for bodies of deceased Palestinian fighters, implementation of a reconstruction plan in Gaza, and border crossings for movement in and out of Gaza are reopened. So that's sort of the end goal, really, that's being aimed for. Well, not the end goal, because obviously that's going to involve either a two-state or a one-state solution, all these very, very big questions, but sort of at least something that can go into the longer term. There are, of course, many ways in which the deal could falter before then. For example, Hamas has asked for written guarantees that the ceasefire will hold for as long as is needed to agree to the details of phase 2. Israel has reportedly refused that, meaning that Hamas has settled for verbal guarantees from the United States, Egypt, and Qatar. But that could mean Israel threatening new strikes as a form of pressure during the negotiations. That sounds very likely to me. It could even resume its assault on the enclave at any time. Something that Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly threatened. I'll be joined in a moment by Daniel Levy, a former Israeli negotiator, Middle East commentator who we often get on this show. For now, Helena, this seems like a rare piece of good news.
I mean, that's the important point for the moment, is we can take the small wins where we get them, which is one of the first things that we're going to get out of this ceasefire deal is a massive amount of aid going into Gaza, which is ironic that this is part of the ceasefire deal when we were told over and over again by Israeli officials that there was nothing impeding the flow of aid into Gaza beforehand. Well, if you can massively increase it now, then you could have done that before. But regardless, this is the important point. There is a roadmap to where a potential end to this genocide can be moved towards. Whether or not that happens, that's a different question. I think the biggest reason why I think that this is unlikely to be a long-term solution is that one of the big problems, one of the sticking points as far as Netanyahu was concerned, when this was first proposed months and months and months ago, was essentially nullified a bunch of Israel's war aims. There was the explicit war aims of the overall control of the Gaza Strip and of the removal of Hamas as a political entity entirely, rather than just removing them from power. But the destruction of Hamas was clearly one of their military objectives going into their invasion and genocide. And on top of that, there was the less broadcast aims of the Israeli administration, which was to annex more of the territory of Gaza to bring it into Israel proper. Now, none of these explicit aims or implicit aims get seen to in the deal that's been proposed here. So will we see Israel break this moving forward? Well, they already have a reputation for mowing the lawn, for engaging in plenty of military action within all of the occupied territories up to this point. So I don't have much confidence, but at the very least, we have some position to be able to move back to if things deteriorate further in the long run. But the first point, where we get a load of Palestinian prisoners freed, where we get the return of the hostages, and we get an end to the genocide, that is the most important thing, at least in an interim period, that we can take as the win that it is for a moment. As well as that, it's interesting talking about about what the future of Gaza looks like. Well, Hamas have conceded they won't immediately return to governance, and there's going to be some Palestinian authority. But a lot of people have a lot of skepticism of the PA. So I don't think that's going to be a long-term solution either. It'll be interesting to see if one of the prisoners that does get released from Israeli jails as part of this hostage swap is Marwan Barghouti, who is probably the only figure who could see a large amount of unity between the more moderate people within like Fatah and places like that, and the more kind of militarist factions such as Hamas and PIJ and the PFLP, etc. He could be a real unifying figure that could lead to something a little bit more cohesive between the West Bank and Gaza in the future. We'll see if that comes to pass within these hostage negotiations and the ceasefire deal. What's frustrating, though, what is infuriating out of all of this, given that this deal that we're looking at right now, this ceasefire deal, is markedly similar to the one that was proposed months and months and months ago, why is it taken until now? Why is it taken until now for a representative of the American government, and not even the American government yet, the prospective American government, to go to Israel and tell Netanyahu to stop? Tell him, no nonsense, this has to end now. The ceasefire deal has to be agreed. I don't care about what you think about when we should meet or not. Let's meet, let's get this deal done, let's get it sorted. And now we have Trump taking the credit for a hostage negotiation on a deal that was done months and months ago. And how many people have been killed? How much blood has been spilled? How much of the genocide has continued for the months since that deal was originally drafted initially? And all it took was somebody just going over there and telling Israel to stop. That could have been done ages ago. That could have been done by the Biden administration or by Antony Blinken or any of his underlings between then and now, and it hasn't been. It hasn't been at any point up until now. And it shows you, we obviously saw the people from the State Department who told The Guardian that they didn't actually have any plan. They didn't actually have any positions that they held. They were just doing what the Israelis told them to do and acquiesced to their every desire. We saw this again and again and again. Oh, well, invading Rafah is a red line. All these other things are red lines. All the red lines got passed, and the Biden administration did absolutely nothing. Did absolutely nothing. And it just shows you that if someone wants to go to the Israeli government and tell them to stop, there is historical precedent for this. There is plenty of historical precedent for this. Ronald Reagan, one of the most hawkish military presidents in American history, behind possibly George Bush, said to Menachem Begin during the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, called him up specifically and said, you have to stop, this is a Holocaust. And he used the word specifically because globally, internationally, the image people saw about that conflict was a 7-year-old with its arms blown off. And he specifically used those words to the Israeli prime minister at the time to get him to stop the invasion. And what happened? 20 minutes later, not 20 minutes later after Reagan had phoned up Menachem Begin, they had said, I have spoken to Ariel Sharon and we are going to stop the incursion. That's how much power the American president has to stop Israel doing what it's doing. In fact, to the point at which Ronald Reagan remarked to his aides that he didn't realize that he had this much power to stop Israel doing what it was doing. And this just shows, given what's happened, when all it took was Stephen Witkoff going to Netanyahu and telling him to stop, that they have stopped, that was an option that was always on the table. It was always on the table for the Biden administration. They could have stopped this point blank whenever they wanted. Whenever they wanted, they could have stopped this. And they have chosen not to. They have chosen not to do this. So much for cementing Biden's legacy, having found a ceasefire agreement before the end of the presidency. He will only, and I mean only, be remembered for the man who let a genocide happen under his watch, with his money and with his weapons. And that will be his legacy forever.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that in terms of Biden's legacy. I mean, I'm actually sort of thinking about this a bit more skeptical of the idea that this was possible because finally there was sort of an American negotiator who was willing to stand up to the Israelis. I mean, everything we know about Donald Trump would suggest that that's a little bit implausible. And to me, it seems actually that this is more about the fact that Biden is leaving than the fact that sort of Trump has come here and has put his foot down, because Netanyahu does have an interest, right, in those hostages being released. That hasn't been his priority. His priority has been to make Gaza completely unlivable. But, you know, he does have this secondary desire, which is to have the hostages released because that lowers some of the pressure within Israel in terms of Israeli politics. And he's in a bit of a win-win here, because I think one of the reasons why he might not have wanted to do that sort of agreement and gone into a ceasefire is because then he thought he would have to begin negotiations with a Biden administration that at least wanted to hold up the pretense of humanitarian law. Obviously, they didn't really believe in it. Otherwise, they would have made Israel stick to it, and they didn't. But there would have been some sort of pretense that we have to keep to liberal norms, etc. This, to me, feels like, you know, Netanyahu gets the hostages, but it's not going to be difficult for him to begin the war again in sort of just as an explicitly sort of genocidal fashion as he had beforehand, because Trump's going to be in office and Trump is going to say, yeah, go for it. So this, to me, seems like it could be a case of getting the hostages out and then continuing with the original plan, which was to clear out Gaza. It doesn't seem to me that we can be particularly confident that this is anything more than that, though that doesn't mean we shouldn't at least hope for that. Let's go to Daniel Levy for what he thinks on this. Daniel Levy, you'll have heard from many times on this show, former Israeli negotiator, now Middle East analyst. Daniel, how significant do you think this deal could be?
Well, look, Michael, in the very immediate, if it's finalized, and even more so if it's implemented, one hopes that means an end, or at least a pause, and we'll come back to that distinction, to the daily bombings and civilian casualties from those bombings in Gaza. It doesn't change the horrendous destruction and impossible humanitarian circumstances under which people are living. Of course, Israelis will get out some of those hostages. Israelis being held will get out. Palestinians who've been held in Israeli prisons, thousands of them, not all of them will get out at this stage, certainly. They will often held without trial. So those are really important things. However, there are big question marks over some of the details. There are big question marks whether one will move to a second phase. I just heard you saying there is the possibility, perhaps likelihood even, that this will be just the first phase and that there will be a return to the killing and the destruction. So that means a dynamic, everything must be done, and it may not be enough to create a dynamic which makes that as difficult as possible. And then you look at this, and anyone who's pored over the texts from several months ago and gets to see the text from today will notice how little difference there is. Tens of thousands of Palestinians, some of those hostages also, have died in the interregnum. So much destruction.
What's your assessment of why this has happened now? You know, there's one analysis sort of Trump is playing a bit harder than the Biden administration. Do you think that's what's happened?
Yeah, I did catch the end of your thought on that. And we're going to disagree a bit on this. So Netanyahu did not want to get to this moment. His politics are much more difficult to manage under the new circumstances created by this deal. He has cabinet ministers who come out openly against it. He has some kind of rebellion in his coalition. Now, let's get from there to, okay, so what was the Trump role here? Did he put real threats on the table? And I think we will get a lot of speculation about what threats were issued and what promises were given by Trump. And I don't think that's the story. I think the story is Netanyahu's perception of how he would have to manage a Trump relationship as opposed to how he was able to manage a Biden relationship. And Trump could hit the ground running because Netanyahu was already nervous. Netanyahu knew that he could lead the Biden administration by the nose. Now he knows also that when it comes to Trump, this isn't going to be a pro-Palestinian rights administration. It's not like Netanyahu is going to go, oh no, you might force me to end apartheid, end the occupation. No, none of those things. But he can't be certain that Netanyahu, that his own personal political interests, and that's the driver here, that his own personal political interests will always be accommodated by an unpredictable Trump administration. And I do think that's been the key difference. People will say, oh, but, Trump won't be like that. He won't when it comes to the permissive environment for even greater violations of Palestinian rights. But he might be when it comes to, who are you, guy? I'm the president of the superpower. MAGA, not MIGA, not make Israel great again. I'm the superpower here. And for me, this is also the final and perhaps most damning indictment of the Biden administration. All that leverage, and they were so pathetic and they got rolled every single time. And people will say, wow, great, outgoing, incoming administration worked together to get this done. No. The Biden people would have had us here until Israel exclusively decided. Bibi did not want to face this dilemma, but this time he couldn't avoid it.
I mean, does he face a dilemma? I suppose that's what I find sort of somewhat confusing because, the deal seems to be written as, I mean, it hasn't been published, has it? But it just doesn't seem to me that it's going to be that difficult for him to get the hostages out, go through this 42-day thing and say, oh, well, there still isn't security in Gaza, so we're going to have to go back. Let's sort of finish what we started. What are the barriers to that just happening again and this all continuing in 42 days' time?
So I'm going to try and make the case that both can be correct. That had it have been the case that there was no risk entailed, he would have done this a long time ago. So on the one hand, Netanyahu, I think, is relatively confident that as long as he does just enough, if he wants to blame the other side, people are always in the West, in the US, certainly in the Trump administration, going to believe him, and you can go back to the devastation and destruction. But, and this is what's always made him nervous. Number one, the act of making a deal is already destabilizing to his coalition. And that's happening right now, Michael. That's the story of the last few days when it became clear that something new was afoot in Israeli politics. So number one, there's that. Number two, he doesn't want unpredictable dynamics, which he's not in total control of. And once this gets in motion, so first of all, you've got this question, the pressure from the families, which has really dissipated. But now when you see people coming out alive, as one imagines you will, then the families who aren't in that first phase will say, hell no, you can't stop now. And there will be more momentum behind that. You will see, perhaps, if the Western media, which hasn't done its job so far, the mainstream media, if they go in and show us, you may see things, you're likely to see things that the Israelis really wanted us not to see. You may see some of the ramping up of the humanitarian. So, and Trump may say, no, we're getting this done. It doesn't mean we can't do other things that you really want us to do. And you're already getting the talking points out of Trump. Because Netanyahu is saying to Trump, I need stuff to work with my public, with my coalition. So you can get all of that. But this adds, again, if you ask me to place a bet, He can and is more likely than not to go back to horrendous destruction there. But it is not nearly as controllable once you set off on this track, including his coalition. Also remember, by the way, he's got troops in Lebanon. He's still bombing Lebanon, despite the ceasefire agreement there. He's got troops in Syria. He's occupied part of Syria beyond the existing occupation of the Golan. They're bombing in Syria. You can do lots of bad things in the West Bank, and I haven't even mentioned Iran yet.
So I suppose how I'd been thinking about sort of Netanyahu's war aims in Gaza for a while, it seemed to me that sort of the war aim seemed to be, to clear people out from at least a significant part of Gaza, maybe the whole of Gaza ideally, but if that's not possible, at least some of it. And therefore sort of making sense of Israel's military actions seemed to be they're destroying the things that make life possible, infrastructure, homes, water supplies. And my sort of guess was that Netanyahu was waiting for Trump to come into power and saying, look, these people can't live here. This is unlivable. And Trump sort of bullying some neighboring countries into taking the Palestinians in Gaza as refugees. Does that sound plausible to you? And how would this ceasefire deal relate to those kind of war aims if they are what Netanyahu is thinking?
Again, that's one of the reasons he didn't want to find himself here. He doesn't want to be here and he'll hope not to stay here. But I would add, there are differences in the Israeli system on this. So I think that's right. One of the war aims has been make it uninhabitable, make it unlivable. And I think there is good reason to fear, by the way, that if the guns do for an extended period of time fall silent, but Israel, as it for sure will, nickels and dimes everyone literally to death in terms of the games it's going to play with the humanitarian assistance access getting into Gaza, then a more dangerous time might even be when Gazans see, oh my God, the guns have stopped, the bombs have stopped, but things are hopeless here. And he will continually try to, I think, create circumstances where there's a possibility of pushing that population out. And that's why northern Gaza and the ability of Palestinians to move back to northern Gaza has been one of the most contentious issues. And I would imagine will be during implementation, because that's part of this depopulate Gaza, resettle Gaza. And that's at the crux of a lot of the political disagreement inside Israel. I say there's a disagreement because for others, it's enough that Gaza is destroyed and that all the diplomatic goings on now are about, will it be rebuilt? What conditions will it be rebuilt under? And Israel making everyone jump through hoops and play that game. The other thing we just have to acknowledge is this clearly isn't total victory. Hamas is still there. They've taken out 15 Israeli soldiers in just the last week in 4 different operations when Israeli soldiers were in northern Gaza. So that's also not something Netanyahu wants to be left with.
Because presumably, even if it does only last 42 days, this does give Hamas or what's left of it a chance to regroup. That would pose at least some military challenges were sort of Netanyahu to try and just sort of continue where he left off. In 42 days' time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even to get to the full implementation of phase 1, there's going to have to be a redeployment of IDF troops already. So again, that's why I'm suggesting not that Netanyahu is in a trap that he can't get out of, but Netanyahu is in a place that he would rather not be, because if he's going to see the implementation of the first phase through, then he is going to have already to, in some significant measure, redeploy his troops. It's also why I will continually say, be careful, the devil's in the detail, including of the redeployment.
Daniel Levy, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael.
Let's look at some more reactions to the news. Daniel, they were sort of talking about the complex politics of Israeli hostages being released, whether that makes life harder or easier for Netanyahu. Of course, in the meantime, it's relief for the families of those hostages. This is someone speaking to Reuters.
As we hear about the deal that is coming on, we are very happy about it, first of all. But, we wait during the last days to hear about it. But it comes with feeling about all the hostages, because we know it's part of them, not all of them. And for us, it's only the beginning. We want them all here, okay? Because it's not end and it's not enough if just some of them will come. And we have the 2 guys from our kibbutz. We want them here, and with all the other hostage, the dead and the lives. And this is what we are waiting for and we wish for. And actually, we don't know their conditions. We are hoping they are good and well, and we'll see them soon as possible, alive and healthy with their families.
And let's now go to a tweet from the Palestinian ambassador to the UK, Hassam Zomlot. So he says, "We breathe a huge sigh of relief that a ceasefire deal has finally been reached after 15 months of mass murder and total devastation in Gaza. The world will see the magnitude of Israel's criminal and genocidal aggression. It will see the price of the collective failure to stop a genocide. Now let the journey of healing begin, starting with burying our dead, attending to our wounded, providing for basic human needs, and rebuilding livelihoods. The world must not fail us." Again, we can also go to Zara Sultana, independent. Well, she's a Labour MP, isn't she, without the whip? She says, "After 15 months of genocide in Gaza, a ceasefire has been declared, but the US, UK and others must be held accountable for arming these atrocities. We'll keep speaking out until the siege lifts, aid flows, schools and hospitals are rebuilt, the occupation ends and Palestine is free." And the Green Party co-leader Carla Denya, well, this is a long one, isn't it? Breathing a sigh of relief that after 15 months of bloodshed, there will finally be a ceasefire in Gaza. My thoughts are with all of those who lost loved ones in this horrific violence and those who will continue to suffer as a result of the destruction of hospitals, schools, and land needed for food. Today, we mark an end to the fighting and the return home of the Israeli hostages and hundreds of detained Palestinians. Tomorrow, the work begins to rebuild infrastructure, communities, and lives, and to pursue justice. The genocidal horror that we have witnessed in Gaza must never be allowed to happen again. Leaders across the world must now push for an end to the ongoing occupation of Palestinian territory and for all those responsible for war crimes to be held to account. Helena, it was interesting listening to Daniel Levy there. He seems to think that this deal is more significant than maybe I was giving it credit for, and it wasn't just the case that, you know, Netanyahu gets to release the hostages and then doesn't really have to incur any costs and go back in 42 days' time. He seems to think that this is something that Netanyahu, you know, didn't necessarily have as his sort of ideal outcome, and the unpredictability of the Donald Trump administration has to some degree forced his hand, which I suppose was speaking more to what you were saying before I spoke to Daniel. What did you make of that interview?
I mean, I think I really took in point that he made about Trump's personal ego being something that Netanyahu now has to contend with. It was interesting reading through some other Haaretz pieces on the deal that was arranged. In the previous kind of propaganda thing with Netanyahu was continue with me, with Trump coming into government, we're going to have what we want. And then immediately in the background, speaking to people, he's saying, no, it's Trump that wants us to be able to stop right now. And I think speaking to Trump's personal desire to be seen as the big man, to be seen as the superpower, to be seen as the one who's calling the shots, that is something that is far more difficult to contend with, as Daniel rightly said, than a pretty piss-weak Biden administration that seems to be taking Israel's cues as rote and not seeming to divert from them whatsoever. I think internally, politically as well, whilst a lot of the Trump base, especially the MAGA base, America first, quote unquote, they are all very pro-Israel. They all get angry at Palestinians. I don't plenty of reasons as to why that is. But what they also don't like is the idea of American money being spent overseas. It's America first, right? As Daniel pointed out, make America great again, not make Israel great again. So what will happen, I think, that is if Netanyahu does want to continue, that will rely on US aid, and that's going to be increasingly more difficult over time because, first of all, he have to contend with his own base that want to see that money spent on Americans or being used for tax cuts from his friends over in the business sector as well, especially people like Elon Musk too wants to see more cuts too, and he's a little bit more Israel skeptical than Trump is. But on top of that, he'll have to contend with opposition from the Democrats within government as well. So there's a lot that Trump has to contend with internally that I don't think he wants to do to satisfy his own base. And of course, they will be happy to watch him be a strongman, even with political allies, just like he has been with other political allies and the potential to be strongmanning with the relationships between Ukraine and America, for example. So I think that's relevant. And also, whilst we're here, I just want to pour one out for Hassam Zomlot, a man who's been through so much throughout this entire conflict, somebody who's lost, I think double digits worth of family members, had to deal with going on to the news and being asked to condemn Hamas on an interview where they specifically mentioned the fact that Israeli airstrikes had massacred members of his family. So his magnanimity in the face of such brutality against his people and his family. And I just want to thank his personal work that he has done to bring this to the attention of Western audiences, and particularly the British audience, has been very eloquent to do so up to this point.
This is a interesting update. There's a statement from Netanyahu's office. Netanyahu's office has apparently said a deal still has not been reached. And this is a quote. Due to Prime Minister Netanyahu's firm stance, Hamas backed down at the last moment from its demand to alter the deployment of forces along the Philadelphia corridor. However, several clauses in the framework remain unresolved, and we hope the details will be finalized tonight. So this is what we were saying sort of at the start of the show seemed like a real shift when it came to Netanyahu's sort of red lines. So this idea that you would have the Israeli military sort of continuing to occupy a large strip dividing Gaza in half, that seemed to be sort of something that Netanyahu didn't want to sort of compromise on, I suppose, because that's sort of a symbol and also a practical sign of having sort of complete control over Gaza's, or Palestinians in Gaza's freedom of movement, and being able to divide the polity in two. That gives Israel a lot of control. The initial reports had been that Israel had agreed to withdraw to the edges of Gaza, so basically withdrawing from the Philadelphia corridor. It seems now, and potentially why we still haven't heard an announcement from the Qatari Prime Minister, is because what's going on in the background is wrangling over this specific clause. So Netanyahu saying, I held strong, and Hamas have now agreed that we can continue to occupy the Philadelphia corridor. That's only coming from their office, so it hasn't been confirmed from any other sources that is the case. Obviously, that would be a big win for Netanyahu. I was going to say a big infringement on the sovereignty of Palestinians in Gaza, but that would be an understatement for what we're witnessing in a strip which is occupied and being subject to a genocide. But in terms of sort of Netanyahu retaining maximum leverage, he seems to really value that Philadelphia corridor, and that does seem to still be up for negotiation. Maybe we'll find out later tonight. Or tomorrow. Of course, it seems like the Israeli cabinet are going to have a debate on this as well. One thing I think that came through from Daniel Levy's interview is that, politics in Israel is somewhat fragile. Obviously, there's massive sort of consensus and unity that they have no interest in a Palestinian state and they don't really care much about Palestinian human rights. That seems to be sort of a supermajority who believe that. But in terms of precisely how this war should be fought, there are divisions. There are divisions within Netanyahu's cabinet between Netanyahu is fairly far right, let's be real, but then also these people who are much more explicitly far right, who basically want to just say, we're going to occupy Gaza now, let's resettle the strip, which isn't something he says publicly. So clearly some divisions there. Interesting point being made by Ryan Grimm that I think it's worth us talking about. From Dropsite, formerly The Intercept. He says, according to the conversations in Israeli media, one thing holding Israel back from a ceasefire is the concern that when Western reporters and human rights groups are allowed in, the true scale of the crime will shock the global conscience in a way it hasn't yet. Now, that to me does seem really important. And I suppose one of the things that makes this so apparent is how, for the last year, basically, no one knows how many people have died in Gaza, right? We spoke to an expert on Friday who was saying their assessment is that 40% more people died directly from the conflict, so from a bomb or from being shot, so from a sort of violent impact, as opposed to from a lack of healthcare or a lack of food or water or disease. So she thought, and her study suggests that 40% more people have died than the Gaza Health Ministry says, which is around 47,000 people now. So it could be that once journalists are able to go in, and people are able to actually survey what's gone on, sort of the gravity of what Israel has done will become apparent, and that will shift global opinion. Of course, and this is where I think I am still sticking to some degree with my line that it's not necessarily Trump's strength that has got this deal, but rather the fact that Netanyahu isn't particularly scared of the Trump administration. That means he was more comfortable doing this deal than he otherwise would have been. Because think about it, if sort of journalists going into Gaza sort of shows people the horror of what's going on, is Trump going to care? You know, I mean, you could say that Biden administration wouldn't care either, but if I do think it's sort of reasonable to say that the Biden administration was more, not that it was very, but more concerned about global opinion than Donald Trump will be. And so if it turns out that journalists go in there and they find out that the death toll is really large, sort of the amount of destruction is just unfathomable, and that shifts opinion in, say, European countries, then I don't think Netanyahu thinks, well, that will then put pressure on the American administration and they won't allow us to sort of continue because Trump doesn't care what Europe thinks, right? And Biden, to some degree, did at least a little bit more than the Trump administration. Helena, I want your thoughts on this issue of sort of what will be the impact of journalists going in there. And I suppose back to that discussion we've been having really throughout tonight's show, which is, does this show the extent to which Donald Trump is going to be able to discipline Netanyahu more than Biden was, or does Netanyahu's sort of willingness to enter this ceasefire now actually demonstrate his confidence that Donald Trump is going to let him do whatever he wants once he's in office?
Well, it's interesting that the point of contention over the potential ceasefire deal is the maintenance of the Philadelphia corridor. Now, that's in the south of Gaza. That's along the border with Egypt, I believe. It's the Netzarim corridor that goes through the center of Gaza. My assumption would be that, given that Israel controls obviously all of the borders around the points where it intersects, where they connect themselves with Gaza, is the potential for any amount of aid going through the Rafah crossing into Gaza through Egypt, how they can control that, but they can also control the movement of people as well. And of course, there are their own security concerns that they personally have over the idea that, well, Hamas and PIJ and the PFLP and other resistance groups in Gaza can be able to rearm themselves if there is access between Gaza and Egypt. So maintenance of control of the Philadelphia corridor gives them another checkpoint to be able to ensure that they have full control over every border of Gaza, to ensure they know what's going in and out. Now, that obviously, those things I think are the main things they're going to put forward to the international community are the reasons they want the Philadelphia corridor. But of course, they can then control which journalists do or don't go into Gaza to be able to report on this too, if they have control of the Philadelphia corridor as well. So there is, I think, plenty of merit to this idea that one of the things that has stopped a lot of the ceasefire agreements up to this point, as far as Netanyahu is concerned, outside of his own personal aims of the conquest of Judea and Samaria, but the idea that the international community's reaction, far from the fact that the international reaction has already been pretty much anti-Israel outside a precious few countries in Europe. But even in those countries, their opinions could be turned if we saw the real reality of the extent of the destruction and the genocide within Gaza. I mean, this is why they've been targeting journalists, why they put black marks over the heads of 6 journalists in particular and tweet them out to the world, is because they want everyone else to know that they are not going to allow the on-the-ground reporting to let people know the reality of the extent of what they've been doing. We've been reporting on this for months and months, the war that Israel has waged specifically against the citizen journalists of Gaza, as well as people who are working for international agencies in Gaza as well. I mean, this isn't the first time we've seen Israel attacking journalists in Palestinian territory since they bombed the Associated Press and Al Jazeera offices in the West Bank. So I think there is certainly some merit. I'm not going to try and say I'm the oracle on either side of this issue, but there's plenty of merit to think that once the hostages have gotten out, to ensure that people don't cover up what's happened. This has been happening in plenty of genocides before, where there was an attempted cover-up of the scale of the destruction before people found out what happened. So the idea that there is a potential that the idea that there could be political capital gained from Netanyahu freeing some hostages. Whether that's the kind of big split in Israeli society in terms of their politics. There's no one who cares about the Palestinians, but there are plenty of people who think that the war should end to free hostages, and there is another kind of half the population who think that the war aims are the most important thing, and that the needle between those two has swung over time. If you can capitulate to one half of them by freeing the hostages, and then you have open season to continue the war later on under a Trump administration, you've essentially won both camps, and you have political leverage with your own population, having both freed the hostages and continued the war aims. So if Trump is happy for them to do that, there is plenty of leverage for them to do that once he comes into power. Whether that happens or not, again, I can't claim to be the oracle on this issue, but if I could, that teases out where the point of inflection is, though, on what Trump's position would be or won't be, I guess.
So I can see on one of my screens the Qatari Prime Minister is now speaking. We'll get a clip of that for you very soon. In the meantime, let me read from Reuters on this issue with the Philadelphia corridor, which seems to be to some degree in dispute. So they report Israeli forces will withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor, a strategic ribbon of land along Gaza's border with Egypt, and complete it no later than day 50 of the truce, according to a copy of the deal obtained by Reuters. Talks underway to open the Palestinian Rafah crossing to allow the entry of international aid into Gaza. Citing an Egyptian security source, Egypt is preparing to bring in the largest possible amount of aid to the Gaza Strip. So suggestions there that this would allow much more movement of aid from Egypt into Gaza. I suppose in a way, I'm also worried. I suppose the Israelis just lose their excuse as to why international media won't be able to go into Gaza right if there's a ceasefire, because up to this point, they've been saying you can't go in there because it's a war zone. If it stops being a war zone, then it's much harder for them to allow them in there. But I still wouldn't put it past the Israelis to sort of say you can only go into Gaza if you go on our sort of embedded tours, although I suppose there will be less Israeli troops in Gaza. So, I mean, presumably we're going to see a lot more than we have seen up to now. We're going to get a lot more information than we have seen up to now. Lots of people in the comments saying they want to see criminal investigations. Absolutely. I mean, hopefully this will allow the ICC to go in there, right, and do proper investigations that they hadn't been able to do before. Let me know, guys, when we can get a clip of the Qatari Prime Minister. US, so this is, so the Qatar, what has he said? So Qatari Prime Minister has announced a Gaza ceasefire and hostage release deal. He said it's been reached. So it's the first time sort of we've had this official confirmation as opposed to confirmation from sort of senior people speaking to journalists. Apparently the agreement will enter into effect on Sunday, the 19th of January. So in 4 days' time. Phase one of the agreement will go on for 42 days and will include a ceasefire and the withdrawal of Israeli forces to the east, away from populated areas, he said. So away from populated areas, but in fact, that could still include quite a lot of Israeli military within the borders of Gaza, I would imagine, if it's just saying they will be away from populated areas. Helena, I suppose an issue here is, people will be able to go back to their homes. I mean, those homes are destroyed. I mean, what is that going to look like? Because, I mean, at the moment, obviously, people are in these horrific sort of tent encampments close to the sea in the south of the Strip. But being able to go back to your homes in the north, and we said earlier that they might only be allowed to do this by foot. I mean, that's going to be a really, horrific experience. And sort of, what will that moment look like? Do people immediately start rebuilding when sort of they know that it might be the case that in 42 days those houses just get bombed again?
I mean, the process of rebuilding is going to be an incredibly long process. You've got to clear, 70% of the buildings that have been destroyed are now all rubble. It's rubble everywhere. Like, you can't rebuild a life. You can't rebuild a community. You can't rebuild a settlement on top of the ruins. Because it, of course, was a very densely populated area. These were tower blocks. These were full tower blocks that have been felled by the IOF in Gaza. So the idea that this is something that we can rebuild upon, like, quickly enough that, you can return to your homes and then we start rebuild. That's far, far, far in the future. So for them to say, well, we're only going to stay away from the populated areas, is everywhere has been depopulated. They literally cleared out all of North Gaza. And where you, as you say, it's all been destroyed. Where are they going to go? I mean, I can only imagine, it's for all of the personal stories that we've seen, and legitimately so, the personal stories that we've seen all the days since the California wildfires of last week. We've seen so many personal stories on social media, on news programs of people returning to their burnt down houses and realizing they have nothing left. Everything that they've built up, their life that they've created for themselves, they have nothing left. This has been the reality on the ground in Gaza for 15 months. And whilst there's plenty of aid coming from the federal government in America to help people rebuild their lives and to find them at places for them to go elsewhere in the country, there's nowhere else for Gazans to go. There are no houses for them to live in. Your choice is living in rubble or refugee camp. That's it. That's the only option that they have at their disposal. So all of this, look, the agreement, I guess there's not much else you could really tease out of that agreement because there are no houses at all. It's a depopulated area which has been completely reduced to rubble. So it seems like the choices for these Gazans is incredibly slim. And I can only imagine how these people would be reacting and feeling to watching how can they see hope in the future looking at an entire community that's been leveled. I have no idea.
I think we're going to be able to go over to the press conference with the Qatari Prime Minister where he's taking some questions.
How much confidence do you have that the deal will progress beyond phase one, sir?
Well, we have faith, Becky, that brought us to this moment. And I think that's the most important part, that we are committed. We will continue to do everything we can, everything possible, together with our partners to ensure that this deal is implemented as it's agreed. And this deal will bring us peace, hopefully, at the end of it. I believe that it all depends on the parties of the agreement and acting in good faith in that agreement in order to ensure that no collapse happening to that deal.
Can I just follow up? What mechanisms are in place to ensure that neither side breaks the ceasefire? There is a follow-up mechanism that Egypt, Qatar and US are going to handle. It will be placed in Cairo, and this follow-up actually will be a joint team from the three countries that will monitor the implementation of the agreement, and everything is being agreed upon and will be in place hopefully on the day of the execution.
So that was the Prime Minister of Qatar. I've seen some people in the comments saying I'm being a bit overly negative about this ceasefire deal, which I'm perfectly happy to say could be the case. I don't have much hope in terms of how this is going to sort of play out in 42 days' time, but something which is controversially true and we have to fully appreciate is for people in Gaza right now, this is just an enormous relief, right? 42 days without bombardment by Israel and Israeli forces moving back to the borders of Gaza. That is very, very meaningful in the short term, in the medium term. And I suppose to bring that out, let's go to a clip of this is the moment where an Al Jazeera Arabic journalist announces the ceasefire deal live on air.
التي أرهقتني طوال هذه الفترة، وأيضا هذا الدرع الذي كان جزء من جسدي خلال هذه المدة وخلال هذه الفترة الطويلة، والذي كان على مدار الوقت يرافقني، والآن نعلن هنا من داخل قطاع غزة ومن داخل مدينة غزة هذا الإعلان ووقف إطلاق النار للمواطنين ولكل سكان غزة الذين تعرضوا إلى حرب الإبادة وتعرضوا إلى القصف وتعرضوا إلى التهجير وتعرضوا إلى النزوح في هذا الموقف وفي هذا المكان الذي أقف فيه.
Just a scene there showing sort of what this means to people in Gaza who have suffered the most horrific 15 months imaginable. We'll be back tomorrow with lots more analysis of what this means, how long it will last, the sort of political, geopolitical implications. For now, Helena, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Lots of breaking news to talk about. It's been really fabulous being joined by you throughout.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Again, just very happy to be with Novara Media today on an incredibly momentous day.
And we'll have loads more analysis on Novara Media about this ceasefire, its geopolitical implications, whether it will last, talk to experts, to people on the ground. Do tune in tomorrow at 6 p.m. and on Friday at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.